An absolutely stunning development in the Diddy case. Today is June 23rd. Diddy's counsel came forward and they said they are going to call no witnesses, 0 witnesses for the defense case, no character witnesses, no expert witnesses, no former Diddy employees to testify to what a great guy he was and how they saw him treat everybody with respect.
No Diddy.
0, no, no
of
Diddy,
course,
which
no
we
Diddy.
expected forever. Incredible. I'm flabbergasted by this. We thought initially they were going to do 2 to 3 weeks of defense testimony. We thought that was long, but that's what we've been hearing. Then last week they suggested it'd be a day or 2, and now not a single witness.
Bubkiss. They are not going to put on a case after the prosecution rests, which they are about to do. They've got their last witness on the stand. It's another special agent from Homeland Security Investigations testifying about all the stuff that we've heard before. They may have a cleanup witness who reads some more text messages or so forth, but this is it. The prosecution is prepared to rest their case tomorrow after Diddy's lawyers finish their cross-examination of these witnesses. And now they've shown this is the tactic they're going to take. They're going to say that the prosecution has not made the case, has not satisfied the elements of the 3 charges against them. Once again, those are the RICO charge. That's the sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and the Mann Act charges of interstate transportation of prostitutes. Now, their approach to this, I wanted to get your take on, because one of the things that they said they're going to argue on the Mann Act, which you and I have been discussing, and most of the media has said, he's basically laid down on this. He said, the interstate transport of prostitutes, it's too easy of a case to make against him because they booked people from other states to come to perform freak-offs in New York with them. That seemed like a slam dunk, and that he was willing to just concede, basically.
And the punishment for that crime is not that great. So he's probably time served. He's out anyway.
That's not the big ticket item that they went after him for. But the response that they're going to say to this in their closing arguments is along these lines. The escorts have testified in this case. We've heard from Punisher. We've heard from a few other people who got on the stand. And when they were asked, were they paid for their sexual services, they all said, no. What we were paid for as male escorts is our time and our discretion. So they got up on the stand, and it made a lot of sense to me that, of course, an escort would say this. He's not going to admit to a crime on the stand. They weren't testifying under protection of immunity. They're not going to say, yes, I was paid for sex. They say the same thing that all escorts say, which is, I was paid for my time, and then we happened to have sex.
Look,
this doesn't work.
We can have a reasonable debate about whether or not prostitution, sex between 2 consenting adults for money, should be legal or illegal. We can have that debate.
You can have that policy debate till you're blue in the face.
Till you're blue in the face. But right now, prostitution is illegal in all 50 states, and it's illegal federally. So, given that, if it was the case that a prostitute, an escort, a call girl, a streetwalker, whatever name you want to give it,
could wipe away those laws.
Simply by saying, I wasn't having sex with them for the getting paid for the sex, it was for the companionship. You don't say it's $300 for the sex. What you say is it's $300 for the night. That's right. This is the oldest line. Look, if this is allowed, to your point, if this was allowed that a prostitute or the John were to say, I didn't pay for the sex, or I didn't receive payment for the sex, I received it for the companionship, it would nullify all prostitution laws everywhere all at once.
It's almost a joke.
Everybody would say.
It's a punchline almost. I mean, this used to be the old adage was you didn't hand the money to the prostitute, you would leave it on the nightstand. Part of the idea of that was you weren't paying for the sex, you were just leaving it there, and if she happened to take it after a wonderful night, then you haven't paid her for sex. This is preposterous. I want to get to, is this too cynical even for a jury to present this type of argument to a jury that is, pretty worldwide? I think it's so cynical that I think it backfires when you make arguments like this.
I think the prosecution is delighted.
Go ahead and say that. Yeah.
Go ahead and say that. Go ahead and say that Diddy wasn't paying for the for the sex with Cassie. He was instead paying for them to be around each other in the companionship. Can you imagine? We know what Diddy was paying for. We know what his thing is. To watch Cassie and to watch Jane and to watch others have sex with the men. It's not to hang out with them. It's not to shoot the shit with them.
No.
It's to have sex. We know what he was paying for. Go ahead, Diddy. Argue that to the
Make
jury.
that point. Exactly. They ordered from services. These weren't people that they sort of knew as friends who developed into more intimate relationships. These were people who were ordered for freak-offs.
Now, I truly believe that it is the case, probably more so with male escorts than female, but it is the case that some people pay male escorts for companionship.
Yes.
And sex is not part of the deal. So the escorts themselves could theoretically argue that what they get paid for is not the sex, it is for the time. That is not the question for Diddy's guilt. The question for Diddy's guilt is, what was he paying for?
Yeah.
And he was paying for the sex.
Yeah. So I don't think they are taking this argument all that seriously, although it sounds like they will make it. They don't have much else to say on the Mann Act claim.
I don't know why they're fighting it, like we talked about earlier.
I don't know why either. On the other two, they're going to stick with the argument. It sounds like that the relationships with both Cassie and Jane, the woman who testified under the pseudonym, were largely consensual. And they're going to lean heavily on this was a complicated 11-year relationship with Cassie, but it was a all of these freak-offs were consensual, and they're going to have to in some way address the particular instances of being on the plane and being shown the freak off video and threatened to release it and then asking for a freak off. They have to address that, don't they? Because just saying that the relationship was largely consensual, it was. And I don't think the prosecution has run from that. This was a complicated 11-year relationship, but they have pointed to specific instances of threats and force that they need to address in closing.
And remember, the prosecution doesn't have to prove that every single time they engaged in a freak-off, it was due to coercion and force. They have to show that it happened once. And you're going to tell me that what we saw in that video from the Intercontinental Hotel was not an example of force and coercion, or what Cassie very succinctly testified to, that she did not want to have a freak-off, but he said, I will disclose these videos to your friends and family if you don't, and she felt pressured to do so. Do you think there's a way that he gets around that? It's very difficult.
Without any sort of witness testimony, they're just depending on making arguments. That's what closing argument, they're going to submit some evidence. The prosecution has submitted evidence. But without some witness testimony to rebut those kinds of things, all they have is the cross-examination of those witnesses. And I'm not sure it really went anywhere that was profitable for Diddy in terms of his innocence of these charges. So we'll see how far that gets them. I think they're certainly signaling that prosecution has a weak case here, and we don't want to overplay it by telling you Diddy's a good guy because we don't have the hand to sort of make that case. So what we're going to say is, look, he may not be a guy you like. He may have sexual proclivities that are, outside of the norm that people are used to. But this is not a man who is a criminal that meets the elements of these charges that the prosecution has made. I think that's probably the right approach. I think I'd probably put on some defense. I don't know. It seems a little bit overplayed.
Yeah. So all right. So and then the RICO is the third cause of action. We've gone over that many times. We will wait and certainly analyze what it is they say during cross-examination, or I'm sorry, during closing arguments on this. Two other things that came out today. Number one, that the jury watched, I guess, another long 12 minutes or whatever it is of more freak-offs. We had heard that they watched a few minutes last week, compiled together. They watched some more today.
There's sketches of Diddy with headphones on, so maybe he was also watching watching this as well, which I wonder how that plays, if he's going through his greatest hits and how the jury's looking at him watching his old freak-offs. Right. I'm not sure sort of the purpose of showing time after time all of these videos, other than to say that if these were used to extort individuals or force individuals into freak-offs, maybe they want to see sort of like what that looked like.
So the last thing that came out was that Diddy intends to potentially use, his counsel does during cross-examination, this idea that there's these large problems existing in the world, including the sudden conflict in Iran. And shouldn't the feds be focused on that instead of being bedroom police over him?
Yeah, they really want to lean on this because the agents that have been brought into this case who led the investigation and the raids on Diddy's homes are from the Department of Homeland Security. This is Homeland Security Investigations. You've heard the acronym HSI thrown out a lot in this case. They want to say, well, that's about Homeland Security, protecting us from foreign threats. We're obviously involved in this escalating conflict in the Middle East. Why are they bedroom policing our client and wasting resources on this investigation and this criminal trial when they should be focused on foreign interests like that? Yes. I hate these arguments. I hate them in all. These are often made in political realms where you say, like, you're too busy about doing X when you should be doing Y.
As if Trump's on the golf course when there's all these problems going on in the world, right? People can multitask.
That's right. People multitask. The Department of Homeland Security is enormous, and if they devoted some resources to prosecuting Diddy, who they consider to be a domestic threat of some sort to the population, they're allowed to prosecute that and also execute what they need to execute.
I wonder if
hate
the
these
judge
arguments.
will even allow that argument to be made at cross-examination. Cross-examination is not a free-for-all. You have to apply the evidence to the rule of law, and I think this is probably outside the bounds of that. This judge might be willing to give them a little bit of leeway. He's been
Sure.
very tough on the parties so far and sort of limiting what they can and cannot say. I think that maybe let it in, but either way, I think that the jury's going to take this as a bit of a cynical approach.
I gotta say, if these are the two big arguments that we're hearing, they're going to levy in their closing, that the escorts say they were paid for their time and discretion and not for sex, and that the HSI should have been focusing on Iran. It reeks of desperation. I got to say, I mean, this doesn't bode well for Diddy in my mind. If these are the types of arguments you're going to see.
Yeah. All right. I want to. Carter C has asked my favorite question that we've gotten so far during this podcast, but I want to hold it to the end. Enhanced Creator says, so what happens after closing arguments, jury deliberation, and how long does that take? Before we get to closing arguments, just so we know, prosecution's going to either the last witness, or maybe we have another one tomorrow. They'll rest their case. The defense will then make that motion we talked about last week.
A Rule 29 motion.
Rule 29 motion to ask the judge, to say to the judge, as a matter of law, they have not met the elements of their claims. We want the judge on his own right, without going to the jury, to strike down one or more of the claims. Unlikely that they'll prevail.
Very unlikely. They have to make these motions. It's almost malpractice not to sort of at least ask the judge for acquittal before it's sent to the jury and just say they haven't satisfied these elements. No reasonable juror needs to even look at this. This is not the type of case where that kind of judgment is going to be made. I'd be very, very, very surprised if the judge threw this case out before submitting it.
Closing in on 0%. It'll then the judge will say, defense, time to call your case. The defense will stand up and say the defense offers no witnesses. The defense rests. There'll be no rebuttal. At that point, the judge will give instructions, which may last a few hours, to the jury.
And you may see some fireworks between defense and prosecution over what those instructions look like. Yes. There will be what's called a charging conference between the lawyers and the judge to figure out how these are presented to the jury, what boxes they check, what findings they need to make. And there sometimes are fireworks about that. We may see some of those because, everything in this case is interesting to people, but I don't think this case is going to be won or lost on the jury instruction.
If I had to guess, I would say that the jury will get the case on Thursday is my guess. Could happen as early as Wednesday, I suppose. They will then have what?
They say they have 4 hours of oral of closing arguments
per side.
Yeah,
per side.
That's what the defense said.
So that's a full day and maybe a day each.
Yeah,
because you do have breaks. You can't have people sitting there for 4 straight hours listening to this stuff. So that's maybe 2. So I'm guessing that the jury will have the case in deliberations by early next week.
I think that's right. By late Thursday or Friday, it's going to be submitted. They're going to then go to their room to deliberate, where they'll have all the evidence at their disposal, and they'll start talking and taking straw polls and so forth. That'll be a black box. We won't have any insight into that for good reason. And then we'll just wait a verdict.
Those deliberations could last 4 days or 4 hours,
really
4 days, 4 weeks, I guess. But the sort of tea leaves reading is that they will not want to go through the July 4th holiday without having reached a verdict, so they can put this behind them and enjoy their barbecues without their family members.
I think this jury's a little restless.
Yeah.
There's been some indications that they've gotten weary. One didn't show up, said they had vertigo, and I think everyone is reading the room that we need to move this along.
July 1st is my guess. What do you think?
I like July 1st as an over-under. I will actually take the under. I think they might even submit a verdict on the 30th.
Yeah. So Dana, good comment. Violations of the Mann Act can result in a 10-year sentence. They can. They don't. This is not somebody who, it's just not that kind of a case where you have allegations, typically Mann Act violations, where you get the kind of 10-year sentences when somebody is running a ring. And I know Diddy had multiple people, but he was not bringing people in across state lines to service other people. He's not a madam. And that's when you're going to get the Heidi Fleiss type sentences, which are multi-years. This is for his own personal sexual exploration. It was not to service a group of people.
I agree with Jason completely. The one thing I would say is if all they get is a conviction on the Mann Act and the judge feels like the jury missed the boat on the other 2 counts by sort of rendering a not guilty verdict, may want to throw the book at him on the Mann Act a little harder to account for what maybe the judge perceives. Judges do have discretion in these, and he's heard a lot of very upsetting testimony, and I could maybe see him going with a little heavier hand if that's all they get. But to Jason's point, this is not what the prosecution was about. It is not about a Mann Act violation.
Yeah. So last comment before we get back to Carter C. He might get probation. I really wish that the prosecution would have charged him with domestic violence because it would have been a slam dunk case.
They can't do it.
They can't do it.
That is a product of state law. These are federal prosecutions.
And also if you had brought those, you have all sorts of statute of limitations problems, right? I don't know offhand what the statute of limitations for domestic violence is. So even if it had been brought as a state charge, it probably certainly wouldn't have Cassie involved. I think Jane has been a couple of years since she alleged it. So these things get lost in statute of limitations. You have the reason that the federal case still exists is because you have this idea of RICO that it's been happening. It's all part of this giant cohesive criminal enterprise.
Yeah, I've thought for a long time, and I like this comment a lot because as a domestic violence case, putting aside the statute of limitations, which you can't put aside, there are problems with that. It's a slam dunk. If it were timely, this would be a very easy case to prove against Diddy. There's always been an awkwardness to the fit of this federal case because RICO has always landed a little bit awkwardly for people. They want to see mafia bosses. They don't want to see the head of Bad Boy Records. They think this case was largely about his personal life and his private sexual proclivities, not about running a criminal enterprise. And I do understand that. And I think that's where the tension in this case has largely arisen. I do think they've done enough on these counts, in my personal opinion.
Whether
we'll see what the jury thinks
or not is different.
We'll see, but there is an awkwardness to that fit, and you're right to point it out.
All right, Derek, for the moment of truth, Carter C. If you or Derek were defense lawyers, would you defend Diddy?
You go first.
Well, so I was in practice for a long time, private practice for a long time, civil lawyer, big law firm, and we represented the tobacco industry, the asbestos industry, the automobile industry, the insurance industry, we didn't do guns, the alcohol industry. So the idea that I would suddenly push back in this case is probably not true. Look, everybody deserves a good defense, and I mean that. And I meant that when I represented the tobacco industry, as much as they have failings and there's things that they deserve a lot of the blame that they've gotten, they also deserve a defense. A lot of the things that were said about them by the federal government, for example, were completely made up nonsense.
Yes.
And they have a right to defend themselves against that. The tobacco industry, when I was there, also ended up, I was a kid lawyer, but they ended up paying, I believe, the largest civil judgment in the tens of billions of dollars in the history of the United States. So, it does, just because you're willing to defend somebody doesn't mean that there aren't sanctions coming to that person, but you do the best you can. And I pass no judgment against anybody who defends anybody.
Yeah, look, I agree with this largely. Everyone does deserve a defense.
I was expecting it entirely, but you gave me a largely.
When I was in law school, the question was often presented, would you defend Hitler? That was always the sort of thought-provoking question. It's similar to this. I don't think Diddy is like Hitler, but that's the way you present this. Would you defend Hitler? Alan Dershowitz very famously always said, yes, I would defend Adolf Hitler, even though I'm a proud Jewish man. If you're well-heeled enough to get a client like Diddy, and you're a good enough lawyer with a good enough reputation to get a client who is that wealthy and in that much trouble, you probably have other clients you could get as well. I've always thought that you can be a little bit selective in who you want to represent and how if you have a family and you think that, representing a guy like Diddy would reflect very poorly on you in some social settings, I could see saying, I don't need this case. I'll go represent the next guy in trouble who's maybe in trouble for financial crimes and not sexual crimes. I could see that. But I largely agree with you. Everyone deserves a defense, and I do have a sort of mindset that I want to sort of address these things as they come and not sort of pass judgment on people in the way that I practice law.
I think it's an important point. Just because I would theoretically doesn't mean that there aren't clients that would go too far for me personally.
Yes.
But when I look at other people who I've never passed judgment.
Oh, I don't judge the Mark Agnifilos and the Tenny Garagoses at all. No. I think everyone deserves a defense, and they deserve a good
frankly,
defense.
The people I respect most of all are public defenders who represent the worst of the worst and get paid
for nothing.
For it. Agnifilo's a millionaire.
That's right.
Representing these guys.
Yeah, he's just a mercenary. He's taking a paycheck.
Exactly. All right, guys. See you tomorrow.
All right, thanks.